Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much to the Mill Road History Society for inviting me. Now, Cambridge has its fair share of fairly conventional and uninteresting street names and building names. But in a corner of Cambridge, where we are, there is what I think is an unusual and possibly unique pattern of naming roads and buildings after 5 parliamentary heroes of the Civil War. So this talk sheds light on what links those names and how they came about. And the answer, partly to how they came about, spoiler alert, is actually a guest here with us this evening, and I'll introduce her when we get to that point in the talk. So, one day in the pandemic, I am cycling home. This is Coldham's Common. I'm starting at the top, and I'm cycling past the Abbey Stadium, going along and ducking my head as I go under the railway bridge, even though I know I've got 2 feet of clearance. But you do it instinctively, don't you? And then cross the road, and then for once, passing Nuffield Gym, for once, actually looking at the names of the buildings that I'm going past. So we've got Pym Court, right, and we've then got Hampton Gardens, okay, and we've got Winstanley Court. And at this point, I think to myself, well, that's quite a coincidence. And it helps, of course, if you are a bit of a 17th century history nerd, because those names are unified or united through a couple of names that are quite well known. Cromwell, here's Cromwell Road. And next to Cromwell Road, we have Fairfax Road. Okay, right, I think some people have said, yes, I remember that name. So we have here Cromwell, Fairfax, Winstanley, Hampton, and Pym. Now, as I've said, what links these names is that they all belong to people who were very important on the parliamentary side of the English Civil War, or civil wars, if we're going to be a little bit more pedantic. Now, this is unusual because in general, and by comparison with, say, France, we are not very good at naming roads and buildings after significant historical events in this country. Particularly not very good at naming them after people on the parliamentary side of the English Civil Wars. And I think that there is a degree of ambivalence today, and perhaps we could explore that, about the meaning and the legacy of the Civil War. Moreover, I think this pattern of naming is actually not just unusual, but unique. As far as I can tell from some internet searching, nowhere else in Britain has 5 individuals associated with the parliamentary side of the Civil War all in one place. So I'm going to talk about who these individuals were and why these roads and buildings were named after them. And at this point, you're probably thinking, are we really going to get 5 minutes about Oliver Cromwell? I'm sure I don't need that. And the answer is no, you're not, because actually, here we are. Here is a very beautiful miniature, actually, of Cromwell. This is originally this size. Because you're actually going to do the work at this point. So, fingers on the buzzers. You may confer. Your starter for 10. Where was Oliver Cromwell born? Huntingdon is correct. Possibly a bit of a trick question, because some people might have thought Ely, where there is also a Cromwell house. But the Cromwell family, they were fairly wealthy gentry, not aristocrats, were always associated with the area of the Fens around Huntingdon and Ely, and then, where was he the MP? Cambridge. Oh, you're on fire this evening. Yeah. Fantastic. Okay. More tricky. What action did Oliver Cromwell lead in 1642? Oh, yes, sir. Absolutely. So he got wind of the fact that the colleges were going to send their silver plate up to York to support the king's army and the king's court. And with a band of his comrades, he made sure that didn't happen. And this was one of the first actions of the Civil War. What was the Eastern Association? Oh, we've got a little bit of almost as much of a Civil War nerd as myself, perhaps. Yes. So you're right. The Eastern Association was, well, in fact, to begin with, it was an administrative unit, and then it became an armed force. And to begin with, Oliver Cromwell was merely a captain of horse in the Eastern Association. And it went on to play an enormously important part in the Civil War. And the Eastern Association eventually became absorbed into an armed unit that is much better known, and that is the New Model Army, correct. Now, this is an interesting thing because Cromwell went on to become, he began as a fairly humble captain of horse. He became the second most important general on the parliamentary side and a military strategist of genius, according to the military historians. Who did Cromwell describe as that man of blood? Charles I. Charles I. Now, very briefly, there were sort of two civil wars, right? There was a first civil war, 1642 to 46. Now, at this point, I think it's fair to say nobody on the parliamentary side actually wanted to destroy monarchy. At that point, the war was about rebalancing the relationship between Parliament and the King. In that sense, it has quite a long tradition within English history of working out the constraints within which kings could operate. And that was what the First War was about. By the time we come to the Second War, Cromwell uses this typically biblical phrase because he and pretty much all of the army and a lot of the MPs have become completely, have been angered and frustrated and feel bitterly that the king's duplicity and deviousness in prolonging the war and not dealing honestly with the government had caused further chaos, bloodshed, and it was at that point that opinion turned away from just negotiating with the king towards actually perhaps ending the monarchy. How many times did Cromwell dissolve Parliament? Good try, two. Now, I mention this because if you go to the House of Commons, you'll see a statue of Oliver Cromwell outside the House of Commons. And of course, in a very, very important way, he made it possible for Britain to be a parliamentary democracy with a curtailed power belonging to the monarch. But he himself had a famously bad relationship with all his parliaments. He couldn't get on with them at all. Hence, he dissolved them twice and ruled without a parliament. So he was a contradictory figure. It's very difficult to get a grip on Cromwell sometimes. Name 3 countries where he ordered military campaigns. Ireland. Scotland. No. No. Much further away. No. Yes? Who said that? Correct. Jamaica. And by invading Jamaica, Cromwell laid the foundations of the English slave economy of Jamaica. Again, a contradictory legacy. What happened at Burford, Oxfordshire in 1649? Something to do with prisoners.
Caught by Fairfax and Cromwell, and a couple of them, 3 of them were shot.
Can you say again who they were?
Mutineers of the New Model Army.
They were mutineers, but more importantly, they were levellers. They were the levellers. And they were the radical wing of the Parliamentary army and the Parliamentary cause. And they were shot on Cromwell's orders in Burford. It reveals, again, part of the contradictory nature of Cromwell, who was a radical in terms of church reform, but not in terms of social reform. He was pretty conservative. And in terms of political reform, he was absolutely not interested in what the levellers wanted, which was a more equal distribution of wealth and power in the country. Cromwell had no time for that at all. You're doing ever so well. Who were welcomed back to England in 1656? The Jews. 3.5 centuries after they had been expelled, they were welcomed back by Cromwell, kind of personally, and a group of Jews who had been living in Holland came back to settle in Britain. And again, I mention this because Cromwell is such a contradictory character. He had a degree of tolerance for the Jewish people. No tolerance at all for Catholics, and not much tolerance either for the religious radicals on his own side. But he was contradictory. And where is where? Oh. Okay. In which college? In Sydney, Sussex. Correct. So for those of you, actually you clearly all know this story, don't you? But it's a grisly story because after the Restoration in 1660, Cromwell's decomposing body was beheaded, and his head was put on a pike outside Westminster Hall in London. And then, through a process that's not completely clear, it ended up in private hands. Some people collect all kinds of things, right? And eventually was given to Cromwell's old college, Sydney, Sussex. And as I understand it, at any one time, only 2 people in the college know exactly where. So,
where's his body?
It's not known. He was buried in a communal grave pit. Okay. Where would you find this plaque? Market Passage. But it's very high up. It's not immediately obvious. A lot of you walk past it and never notice it. And I wonder whether this reflects a little bit the ambivalence that we have in this country towards Cromwell and the parliamentary side of the Civil War. By the way, I mean, some people take a long time to forgive and forget, by the way. No reigning monarch set foot in Sydney Sussex College until 1996. So more than 300, I mean, talk about bearing a grudge. Okay. By the way, so we have a plaque for Cromwell. If you go up the busway to St. Ives, you will find a statue of Cromwell erected by public subscription. Can you believe? In 1901. I mean, would we do that today? I doubt it. But it has to be said that Cromwell is the one exception to my rule about not naming streets after famous individuals, because actually there is only one person who has more roads and streets named after them in Britain than Cromwell. Who would that person be? Victoria. Okay, we're on to Fairfax. Sir Thomas Fairfax, the Commander-in-Chief of the New Model Army, which he led at the age of 32, the most important general on the parliamentary side. Now, during the political crisis of 1641-2, he was one of the moderates who was anxious for an agreement between the king and Parliament. But when fighting broke out, he and his family supported Parliament, and he led the parliamentary forces in decisive battles, which those of you who can remember your O-level history, these are famous names: Marston Moor, Naseby, Langport, Winceby, anyway. And when the First Civil War ended, Fairfax still hoped for a settlement with the king. He was out of step with the political and religious radicals in the army and in the country who supported Cromwell. He declined to take part in the trial and execution of the king. He resigned his command in 1650 and retired to his estates in Yorkshire. He declined to join Cromwell in the invasions of Ireland or Scotland. He opposed military rule by Cromwell, and in 1660, he actively assisted General Monk in the restoration of Charles II. So a fairly extraordinary career. So what's the origin of Cromwell and Fairfax roads? Oh, sorry, here we go. This is Battle of Naseby. So where did Cromwell and Fairfax roads come from? So Ordnance Survey map from 1925. Down here I've marked St. Philip's Road. This is Ross Street where we are. And to the north we can see Allotment Gardens. And 13 years later, Ordnance Survey map shows that we have Cromwell Road, Brampton Road and Fairfax Road. So it's clear that these roads, which took up a lot of allotment ground, were a 1930s development. And we can be a bit more precise about when this happened. Here is, I think this is actually an advertisement rather than a news story. But this is from, thanks to capturing Cambridge, by the way, this is from the Cambridge Daily News. And if you're wondering, this does look a bit odd. I can't quite work out what's going on here. In that era of history, they sometimes put south at the top of a map. So actually, it should be that way round. And then you can see that we have Cromwell Road here and Fairfax Road here. So this was a 1934 estate, the Cromwell Park Estate. I don't think we call it that anymore, but at the time it was the Cromwell Park Estate. So why would those roads have been named after Cromwell and Fairfax in the 1930s? I'm going to read you something from an academic historian some of you may know, John Lawrence, who used to live in this area. And he wrote again, this is on capturing Cambridge, and he wrote something about why he loved Mill Road, and Romsey in particular. He says, "I was also drawn to Mill Road by its history, and especially by the ways in which it seemed to convey a sense of civic identity and pride that existed independent of the university. This was nowhere more evident than in Romsey Town, where trade unionism and labour politics had put down their deepest roots between the wars, exactly at the time of the Cromwell Park estate, helping to fuel the vivid stories of Red Romsey that some of my neighbours could still recount 50 years later." So I think it's fairly clear that Cromwell and Fairfax were chosen because they seemed in some way consistent with the culture of Red Romsey. And that's not only my opinion, but also it's in the Bible of street names. This is Stubbings and Gray, and they don't give any evidence either, but they think it's highly probable that that is why we have Cromwell and Fairfax roads. Now, also built at the same time was Brampton Road. Now, at first sight, this doesn't seem to have any Civil War connections. And it may, of course, just have been named after Brampton, which is near a village near Huntingdon. Ah, well, that would be a link. But, now this is quite a stretch, so humour me. I wonder whether we might look at Brampton Bryan Castle in Herefordshire. And Brampton Bryan Castle, I want to introduce you to Lady Brilliana Harvey. Lady Brilliana Harvey organised, in the absence of male members of her family, she organised the defence of her castle. And when the king personally wrote to her, war had broken out at this time, right? The king personally wrote to her, encouraging her to surrender. And she replied to him, stating that he, the king, had made many solemn promises that he would maintain the laws and liberties of this kingdom. I cannot then think, she said, he would give a command to take anything away from his loyal subjects, and much less to take away my house. I must endeavour to keep what is mine as well as I can, in which I have the law of nature, of reason, and the law of the land on my side, and you, the king, none to take it from me. A redoubtable woman, and I think that's giving King Charles the finger, really. Now, I've got no evidence at all that Brampton Bryan Castle and Brampton Road are linked in any way, but it would be terribly nice if they were, because it would bring our parliamentary names from 5 to 6, and it would also do a lot of good for the gender balance of this talk. So, Cambridge is not quite alone in having roads named after Cromwell and Fairfax. Hertford does as well. Again, no others have 2. We have 5. So we've done 2, we're going to talk about the other 3. So next we have 2 MPs, John Hampden and John Pym. And they were 2 of the famous 5 members. So this picture, made in the 19th century, it's actually a mural in the House of Commons, shows the king. The king is the one wearing his hat. He has marched into the House of Commons demanding the arrest of these irritating, dissenting Puritan MPs, including Pym and Hampden. And the guy kneeling is the Speaker of the House of Commons. And he declines to tell the king where they are. He says to the king, I can neither see nor speak, but by command of the House. In other words, he is telling the king, Parliament is sovereign. It was a huge moment in English political history. Powerless, and seeing that, as he put it, all the birds had flown, Charles beat a humiliating retreat. It was a pivotal moment in British political history. Here's John Hampden trying to catch a cab. This is a statue of him in Aylesbury. He was a cousin of Oliver Cromwell and the MP for constituencies in Cornwall and Buckinghamshire. And there's a fine statue of him, but as far as I know, there are no roads or buildings anywhere in the UK named after John Hampden, apart from Hampden Park. Oh, that's a lovely. Okay, I stand corrected. Apart from Hampden Park, we are the only place with a Hampden reference. Now, he was a Presbyterian gentleman MP, strongly motivated, like Cromwell, by the desire to erode the influence of Catholicism and of the bishops, and by his defence of parliamentary sovereignty. In 1627, he was imprisoned for nearly a year for refusing to contribute to a forced loan demanded by the king. And 10 years later, he was prosecuted for resisting the king's ship money tax, not because he disapproved of taxation, but because he thought taxation required parliamentary approval. And he remained a thorn in Charles's side and was one of the 5 members that Charles tried to arrest. Hampden raised and led a regiment in support of Parliament, and in truly heroic fashion, he died on the battlefield after being wounded in the shoulder at the Battle of Chalgrove Field in Oxfordshire in 1643. John Pym, MP for Calne and then Tavistock, active in opposing the arbitrary use of royal power by both James and Charles, and he was briefly arrested and taken before the Privy Council in 1621. He was a vigilant and persuasive organiser of the parliamentary opposition to the king and his advisers, culminating in him helping to draft the great declaration of discontent, the Grand Remonstrance, that was presented to Charles in 1641 too. Pym was not a Republican. But he understood that Charles had no intention of honouring any commitment to ruling through Parliament and had to be coerced. He died, probably of cancer, in 1643. And on his death, Parliament dissolved into competing factions. He had a unique ability to hold the parliamentary side together. There are, until my friend here tells me to the contrary, no roads or buildings named after John Pym anywhere in the country. And finally, we come to the most extraordinary, in my view, of the 5 individuals, Gerard Winstanley. Now, on the margins of pretty much every social and political upheaval of the last 600 years, on the fringes of those upheavals, you will find people who we would call communists. They were rebellious individuals and groups who, in terms of their vision of a fair society and their analysis of current ills, were early communists. And Winstanley was the visionary leader of such a group. His group was called the Diggers. Actually, he called himself, his group, the True Levellers, which suggests this was an early example of a dispute about precedence with fringe groups on the left. Diggers or Levellers, some of you who are Billy Bragg fans might be remembering his 1985 song, The World Turned Upside Down, which was about Winstanley and the Diggers. Winstanley was born in 1609, and when his business as a wool trader hit hard times in the early years of the Civil War, he became an agricultural labourer. and a gifted writer and pamphleteer. And in one such pamphlet, he wrote, "In the beginning of time, God made the earth. Not one word was spoken at the beginning that one branch of mankind should rule over another, but selfish imaginations did set up one man to teach and rule over another." In this pamphlet, he called on poor people to rise up and reclaim the land that had been stolen from them, but through non-violence. He set up an agricultural commune at St. George's Hill near Weybridge in Surrey, specifically targeting formerly common land that had been enclosed. He was a practical man, leading his group in clearing the land, planting crops, and he was an inspired author. He set out his egalitarian and pacifist ideas in a book called The Law of Freedom, in which he urged his comrades and supporters to lay the foundation of making the earth a common treasury for all, both rich and poor, not one lording over another, but all looking upon each other as equals in the creation. But their radical experiment was short-lived, a mere 4 months, destroyed by the violent opposition of local landowners. And the site of his vision of a fairer society in Surrey has become a golf course surrounded by Russian oligarchs' mansions. Sad. So here are our 5 Civil War and Commonwealth individuals. Now, what do we know about why, we know why, perhaps why Cromwell and Fairfax roads were named. What about why were Pym, Hampden and Winstanley chosen? And at this point, I have to say a huge thank you to our special guest this evening, Councillor Catherine Smart, who is the source of what follows. I hope you still think this is the case. So, at around the turn of the millennium, plans were in hand to develop the industrial land to the west of Cromwell Road, abutting the railway. And when the land was cleared, a discussion took place within the city about possible names. Now, Councillor John Durrant, Catherine tells me, was the chair of the planning committee at the time. And perhaps intending some degree of historical or political balance, Councillor Durrant suggested that the new buildings should be called King Charles Court. A Labour councillor. And Catherine demurred and said, no, this really won't work at all. These buildings need to be named in keeping with the character of the area that includes Cromwell and Fairfax roads. It was a particularly surprising decision by Councillor Durrant, who conceded the point. But he had been the chairman of the Folk Museum and a founder of the Blue Plaque scheme in Cambridge. So he did have some historical sense. But anyway, we very luckily had Catherine protesting his decision. And she recalls that John laughed, he was a very friendly man, and conceded the point. And for that reason, well, Councillor Smart told me that she isn't sure whether she herself proposed the 3 names that resulted. But it does seem probable, or indeed likely, and a much better story if that's true. So, Hampden Gardens, Winstanley Court duly received their current names. Sorry, I've gone a bit ahead. And it appears to begin with, oddly, that Pym Court, which was the last one to be built, was originally going to be called Veritas Court. And presumably, another bit of homework or historical reflection took place within the planning department, and it was renamed Pym Court, making the trio of parliamentary names. So I conclude that to Catherine Smart should go the credit for at least pointing the planning department in the direction of consistency with the parliamentary tradition round here. And if it wasn't Catherine, then the anonymous officer in the planning department with a sense of history or a sense of humour, or both, deserves our thanks.
Very, very much. Now, well, so we've done that end of Romsey. Now we've moved back down to this end of Romsey. And this is how Alan Brigham described these streets on his Mill Road tour, which I was only once managed to take part in one of those. He acknowledged this from Cambridge street names, which very handily you put up the picture, and it is available in the library by Gray and Stubbings. And I'm just going to read this from the British Empire that he writes about. So, yay. Queen Victoria was designated Empress of India in 1876, and loyal Cambridge street names named streets for part of the empire. Just around this time, Madras for India, Hobart for Australia, Natal for South Africa, Montreal for Canada, and in the same cluster are remembered the Suez Canal, not part of the empire but vital to its existence, opened in 1869, Britain buying shares in 1875, Cyprus occupied by the British in 1878, and Malta occupied by Indian troops in 1878, moved there by Britain to forestall Russian aggression. Hardly anything changes. This beautiful plaque, spotted by Lucy last week, and the photograph taken for me, is on what used to be the district, is now going to be a care facility for some young people. As you go opposite the Alexandra Arms, as you go into the Enterprise Centre and walk through to Mill Road Cemetery. I have walked past there 1,000 times and never looked up, and actually Capturing Cambridge was born in the district, which was an IT centre. And it is very beautiful, and I am trying to find out about that building. If anybody does know, come and see me afterwards. But I've got a few leads on it. So you go in there, have a look up, because nice photo, Lucy. So if you can see where you set off from Britain, and then you go through this, and then you halt just at the bottom of Italy there to go to Malta, then you go on to Cyprus, and then you go down through the Suez Canal, and then you go up to, actually Madras is now called Chennai, and then you go down to Hobart. So this was one of the routes to Australia. The Suez Canal was built in 1869. The British government had actually opposed the project, as they controlled the routes via South Africa. So you can see that they went round that way, and their business interests were all concentrated on that route. So that's why they opposed it. And one skeptic claimed, it will never become a large ship's accessible way in any case. In calm weather, a sailing ship may have taken 4 months to complete the journey via the circular route. A clipper could do it in 2 months, and by the 1900s, steamships travelling through the Suez Canal could complete the journey in just over a month. There were, of course, interruptions to this quick route during various periods of unrest, and in 2013 you could still travel by cargo boat through Suez. So that was, it cost you £3,000, and you could actually go pretty much on that route, but of course recently nothing, because all routes have stopped because of the trouble now. So it's like the Suez Canal has always been vulnerable to political unrest. So I don't know whether we have Chris with us tonight. No, I am here. Jolly good. If you have anything to add when I come to that. So this piece of information was sent to me by Chris Sendall. So the third road, which ran alongside the Newmarket railway line, was named Memora Road. So all these streets, all the ones, the Empire Streets, were here, and then this is Memora Road here. So Montreal and Natal are obviously parts of the Empire in Canada and South Africa, and then we have Memora Road. Now Memora refers to the Sea of Marmara, which is Turkey, so it doesn't really have a connection unless it could be, and here I'm touching on your summarising. Basically, there is a mining town in Canada called Memora, so it could be that one. But either way, again, this whole area was thinking about political things happening around the time it was being built, because this whole area was being developed in between 1870s, late 1870s, 1880s and 1890s. And was still being built actually into 1910, 1920. So this whole area was being developed at that time. But what's interesting about the third road, Memora, is it was built along the line of the railway. So you can see that the railway comes along here. And the line cut through Polecat Farm. But the owner, so Polecat Farm here, the owner was compensated, and he was given his own little platform. And I only knew that because I have been researching Polecat Farm recently. So I have Chris Sendall to thank for the following information about Memora Road. Originally, the line to Newmarket ran here, but because of the tight curve and having to cross so many sidings, the line was diverted to Coldham's Lane, so it went right up and over. The old track was used as a long siding for many years until it was eventually taken up and the land developed for housing in the late 1920s, which is why the houses look so different on opposite sides of the roads. So there you've got the 1930s, late 1920s, 30s buildings, and then you've got the original Victorian houses that were once opposite the railway line. The prevailing wind is usually from the south, so I'm sure the occupants of the houses were relieved when the line was removed, because they'd have had to keep the windows closed, basically. So thank you. Over to Caro Wilson, who's now going to zoom over the bridge, not in a car, but on her bicycle.
So I think Mary and I got chosen to do this talk because we're both on the Mill Road History Society committee, and that's why we got fingered. And I live the far side of the bridge in Willis Road, and I'll just briefly tell you about this little area of Mill Road. Simon's doing the things for me. So a bit of background. After the dissolution of the monasteries, all the lands of Barnwell Abbey were sold off, and by the 18th century, a lot of the land was owned by a man called Thomas Panton, who made his name by being chief equerry to George I in Newmarket. And his son, called Tommy Panton, managed to get an Enclosure Act passed in 1806, which allowed the land to be sold off in parcels. Julian mentioned the Enclosure Act rather early. They carried on for about 2 centuries. Incidentally, Thomas Panton is the man whom Panton Street is named after. And Tommy Panton didn't have any heirs. A lot of his land passed to his niece. Sophie will do this better than I do, who I think had married the Duke of Ancaster and was known as Baroness Gwyder. And that's where we get Gwyder Street. So a lot of the Panton estate was bought by Gonville and Caius College, which already owned quite a bit of land south of what Mill Road is. And the patch that we're interested in is painted yellow by kind permission of Simon, because I can't do that sort of technology. Next slide, please. So the college was fine with that being farmland for a long time. But then in the second half of the 19th century, there was an agricultural depression. Agricultural rents went down, but also the college realised what was happening to Mill Road. After the coming of the railway in, shout it out, 1845, thank you very much, the population of Mill Road instantly grew, and Gonville and Caius realised that their land close to the city would be very popular with some of the new professions, like the editor of the Cambridge News, like various GPs and solicitors, but also with fellows of colleges who for the first time were allowed to marry. And by the late 1880s, all the 4 roads were developed, and the college minutes books records the decision to name them. Thank you, Simon. Here they all are in 1895, with a few inhabitants in each of them. There you can see is the editor of the Cambridge Express. Still at that stage, a bit of a mixture because there's also stonemasons. Thank you. So who were they all? Well, not surprisingly, thank you, Simon. They were all alumni of Gonville and Caius College. Thanks, Simon. Of whom I think the most interesting man is Robert Willis. He entered Gonville and Caius in 1822. He became a priest. He was a foundation fellow. But he was a real polymath. So not only was he a very important mechanical engineer, he was also the first scientist to be recognized for how you make a vowel sound. So he was a linguist. And here's my version of a quiz. He invented the odontograph and the cymograph. So can we have guesses for an odontograph? Nope. Or a cymograph? Next slide, please, Simon. So an odontograph is an implement for indicating or correctly placing the notches in gear wheels so that they interlock correctly. Maybe there is a connection with teeth, because teeth kind of interlock. And a cymograph is fascinating. It's an instrument for tracing the outline of architectural moulding. And Willis's book about the foundation of architectural history is still very widely respected today. His account of right we are. Here's Edwin Guest. He was an antiquarian with papers published on Roman Britain, but also, they were interesting lot, weren't they, these academics, because they didn't just specialise. So he was an expert on the history of English rhythms, but I'm not quite sure what that means. And he became Master of Keys and Vice-Chancellor of Cambridge University. Next slide. Mackenzie was interesting. He was the only one of all this lot who, as a priest, was actually a practicing priest. And he went out to Africa. He joined David Livingstone on one of his expeditions. And he promoted equality in Christian congregations between black and white, which was very unusual for the time. And he died of fever in Africa, and there is David Livingstone planting a cross on his grave. And last but not least, we jump back a century. Here is Collier, who straddled the 17th and the 18th century, and he was a churchman and a very strong conservative. So after the Glorious Revolution, he refused to take the oath of allegiance to William and Mary because he still thought that James I was the legitimate monarch. And indeed, he absolved 2 Jacobites who tried to assassinate William and Mary. So obviously he would have supported that assassination. And I would quite like to read this, he was the author of a short view of immorality and profaneness on the English stage, in which he attacked drama, including Dryden and Congreve. So that's it. Those are my streets down my end of Mill Road.